All right, sounds good. Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the first speaker in the Ethics and Leadership series. This series of talks presents contemporary ethical issues that require strong leadership, careful moral reflection, and deliberative social responsibility. Speakers will engage our community at New Mexico Tech to think more deeply about how we ought to live and to act in a manner that changes the world for the better. This series is supported by Tech alumnus William D. Henderson, hosted by the class department, and directed by me, Dr. Christopher Joe Gluck, Assistant Professor of Ethics. I'm happy to see you all here. Everyone is welcome. This is open to the community. Everybody's encouraged to participate. This should be fun to have a kind of virtual talk, especially given our circumstances where we can still learn from scholars and experts in the field. So just a note about the format before we get started. So this talk, it'll be about 35 minutes or so, is going to be followed by a Q&A. So save your questions for the end, and you'll post them in that little question box down somewhere around where my finger is on your screen, hopefully. Let's see. And so if you're willing to speak your question aloud, please note in your question that we have the ability to kind of bring you up as a video or an audio and talk to Dr. Bersoff. Otherwise, I'm just going to read your question aloud at the end. And you can also upvote other people's questions so there's not too many redundancies. All right, so the talk today is titled Why the Tech Sector is Losing Its Trust Mojo. Our speaker is Dr. David Bersoff. He's the Senior Vice President and Head of Global Thought Leadership Research at Edelman Intelligence. So Dr. Bersoff sees the yearly reports for the Trust Barometer, which we'll hear a little bit more about in the talk today. He spent 18 years as a consumer insights and marketing strategy consultant. Prior to the industry, he taught psychology, specifically social psychology and research methodology at the University of Pennsylvania. And very relevant to our series, Dr. Bersoff before that studied moral psychology for his undergraduate at Yale. And he confided to me in confidence that he found ethics a little abstract and a little divorced from science at the time, but now he's kind of come back full circle. And so I hope that you all enjoy this talk, and if you'll help me in welcoming Dr. Bersoff with your silence, we'll take that as clapping. So.
All right.
All right, thanks, so you can take it away, David.
All right, you hearing me okay?
I can hear you fine. I will get you as spotlight now, so. Good, people are clapping as well, so.
Perfect, all right, let's go. So, as you just heard, the title of my talk is Why the Tech Sector is Losing Its Trust Mojo. And for those of you who don't know, a mojo is a magical power. And for a long time, it seemed like tech had one. I called it the Teflon sector. And it wasn't that tech never had a misstep or never saw a scandal. Microsoft was seen as a monopolistic bully for many years. Samsung produced a phone that caught on fire. Apple made devices in a factory that had to place nets outside the windows to keep despondent workers from jumping to their deaths. And of course, there was Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. But for some reason, these stains almost magically never clung to the sector in a way that affected its overall trust scores. Compared to, say, financial services, which is still not completely out of the trust hole it dug itself into in the wake of the mortgage meltdown. But I'm here to tell you today that those days might finally be over, and that the sector, rather than being able to assume trust, will have to begin making a concerted effort to build it, or in some cases, at least to maintain it. Now, the data you're going to see today that I'm going to use to sort of support and bolster my argument comes from our yearly Edelman Trust Barometer. And in 2020, that was based on 34,000 respondent interviews across 28 global markets. In each market, our sample reflects the general population as much as possible, but because this is an online survey, the demographics in markets with lower levels of internet penetration are likely going to be a little more urban and a little more affluent than the actual population as a whole. Just so you know when this data is from, we were collecting data mid-October to mid-November of 2019. So all of this data is very much pre-pandemic. So let me start the story at the beginning. Trust, or the lack thereof, in a specific sector or industry doesn't just occur in a vacuum. It occurs in the context of an overarching trust environment. Thus, in order to fully appreciate what's going on with technology, you first have to understand how people are feeling about the larger societal context in which technology exists and operates. And as you're about to see, we are not living in what anyone would call a trust-rich environment. And that was even before a general lack of cross-institutional coordination and preparedness had resulted in soaring death rates and an economic meltdown. Now, as we measure it at Edelman, an institution requires a score of 60% or more to be considered trusted. Scores in the 50s are considered neutral or in the middle ground between trusted and distrusted. And yes, 50 to 59 is technically a majority, but we don't consider it a secure or definitive majority of trust. And when their score is less than 50, those institutions are considered to be in distruster territory. So as you can see here, globally, no institution is fully trusted, and government and media aren't even able to crack that 50% threshold. And a lack of trust begins at the top. So in a world in which institutions are not generally trusted, we find 66% of people saying that they don't have confidence that their current leaders will be able to successfully address their country's problems. Now, if we unpack trust into its two constituent parts, the first, competence, which is trust in an institution's ability to get things done or to fulfill its role in society, and second, ethics, which is trust in an institution's motivations, fairness, and desire to do good in the world, the first thing to notice is that big, empty, white space in the top white quadrant. Not a single institution is rated as being both competent and ethical. Business is seen as competent, it's a doer, it gets things done, but it's not seen as ethical, while NGOs are seen as ethical, but not necessarily effective at getting things done. In contrast, government and media are seen as neither being ethical nor competent, with government weighing the others down like a trust albatross. Chronically low trust levels in institutions, jaundiced perceptions of societal leaders, and questions about the competence and ethics of the entities we rely on to create an environment in which we can thrive have metastasized to the point where people are having doubts about the fairness of the system as a whole and are questioning American fundamentals such as capitalism and even democracy itself. Only 18%, as you see here, only 18% of our respondents felt that the system was working for them. The majority of us, 56%, say that capitalism as it exists today does more harm than good in the world, and even 58% believe that democracy is losing its effectiveness as a form of government. Western capitalist democracies were once the beacons of freedom and prosperity. They were the envy, inspiration, and aspiration of the world. But today, these governments are crippled by partisanship, and this pandemic has brought into sharp relief the economic disparities that we've allowed to fester and grow within capitalism as we've practiced it. So why is this not just depressing? Why is this actually relevant to our topic today? Well, the answer to that question brings me to my first main point, which is this. Technology is not a separate institution apart from business or government or media or NGOs. It's a tool used by and a product of all four. Tech itself has no intrinsic goodness or evil. Its moral valence is dependent entirely on how it's used. And currently, tech is being used by and is therefore being viewed through the lens of four non-trusted institutions that are seen as lacking in ethics, competence, or both. And in such a circumstance, guilt by association, I would argue, is impossible to avoid. So that was a summary of where the public is today. But as we know, tech is all about creating and defining new futures. Unfortunately, even before the virus, many people were pessimistic and uneasy about their future. And that really shouldn't be surprising, because if we don't feel that our institutions are creating a present that works for us, there's little reason to believe that they will somehow manage to create a future in which we as individuals will all suddenly start to feel like we're flourishing. Feelings regarding our economic prospects are a huge driver of how people feel about their future. Being able to look towards a better future helps us endure hardships today. It also makes us feel better about government and business during the inevitable downtimes. The problem is that more than half of the markets we measure have populations where a majority don't feel that they and their families are going to be better off in 5 years' time. In fact, as you can see here, not a single developed market is on the optimistic side of this chart. But people's trepidation about the future extends beyond personal economic concerns. Fear of being left behind is primal. It's the stuff of anxiety dreams. And currently, too many people are looking ahead and they're seeing a future in which who they are, what they have to offer, and what they've accomplished is no longer valued. In fact, we found that 57% of respondents were worried about people like them losing the respect and dignity that they once enjoyed in their country. Contrary also to what you might expect, this concern is not associated with a particular demographic, as it holds across generation, level of education, and income groups at about essentially the same degree of anxiety. And speaking as an older, educated, affluent individual, even I'm seeing the okay boomer writing on the wall. And I see this happening to me and my kind as we're being displaced as the generation that matters most, a title we've clinged to with our now arthritic hands for literally decades. And now, really? Okay boomer? That's what it's come to? Thank you. Ceasing to matter, as you could tell in my emotional tone of voice there, is not something people take in stride. It makes them rail against change, fear modernity, reject globalization, and scapegoat immigrants and minorities. The fear of status loss and diminished importance also feeds into perceptions that the system is unfair, that our institutions lack ethics, and that I need to take all I can get now without concern for future generations. And certainly part of this fear of being left behind is driven by job insecurity. But dignity and respect don't stem from financial vitality alone. The fear also comes from not seeing your tastes, values, and beliefs reflected in society or in the media. It comes from feeling increasingly less comfortable and competent with the tools of everyday life. And it comes from feeling disregarded by the people with influence over what our future will look like. Now, I'd argue that three of the biggest drivers of the fear of loss of dignity and respect and of being left behind are significant changes in social values, major demographic shifts, and most importantly, for us, technological advancements. This fear of status loss is ultimately, I would argue, a result of social or societal institutions failing miserably at basic change management. Within businesses, the long-term costs of poor change management are lowered morale, decreased confidence in leadership, and resistance to change, all things that we have seen and will see echoed in this trust data. In order to gain trust, increase their efficacy, and foster a spirit of cooperation versus obstructionism in society, our social institutions, which are the conduits through which technology influences people's lives, need to make change seem less threatening and more inclusive. At the same time, they need to make the people who will inevitably be disrupted by change feel as protected and respected as possible. Now, to be sure, this notion of change management is not new. It's been around since the 1980s, at least in a business context. But I think it's very relevant here. And the key steps, the basic steps of change management are listed here on this slide. Clearly define the change and align it to what's important to people. Determine impacts and those most likely to be affected. Develop a communication strategy. Implement a support structure, and then measure the change as it progresses. Now, the fact that, as you can see here, none of the social institutions we monitor, not government, not business, not media, not NGOs, are seen by a majority of people as having a vision for the future that they believe in, that they can get behind, indicates that these institutions have failed to successfully accomplish even step one, which is clearly define the change and align it to what's important to people. Change management performed at the societal level versus at organizational level does mean that the effective audience that we'll be dealing with here is much larger, and the change that we're going to be helping people manage through is much more complex and multifaceted. But the purpose of change management, whether it be at the organizational level or at the societal level, is exactly the same. It's to get people who fear being left behind to see opportunities for themselves within a future they currently regard with unease and suspicion. Which brings me to my main point number two. As the most, or at least one of the most significant drivers of change, technology has a greater need than other industries to engage in purposeful, effective, and broad spectrum change management, something which it's not done very well if the data on these next few slides that I'm about to show you are any indication. So as I said at the beginning, technology, it's losing its trust advantage, its trust mojo. So what does that look like exactly? Well, it looks like this. It looks like trust in technology declining 4 points globally, and a 4-point drop when you're talking about a sample size of 32,000 is, I assure you, significant. But even beyond that, in 21 out of 26 of the markets that we measured in both 2019 and 2020, we saw decreases in trust in technology. And in some of those markets, we've seen some rather steep declines, both since last year and over time. So just since 2019, we've seen a 10 percentage point decrease in the percentage of people who trust technology in France. We lost 8 points in Canada, Italy, Russia, Singapore, 7 points in the US, 6 points in Australia. And while as a sector, to be sure, technology is still trusted technically in every market but Russia, we're starting to see some cracks in the trust foundation. And I think there's some tangible, clear reasons for that. And that's what I want to go into now. First, people report a general sense that the pace of change in technology is happening too fast. Hence my point about a lack of good change management. If change is feeling too fast to people, it's because they're not being brought along properly with that change. Then on top of that, there's the perception that there's no effective oversight of emerging technologies, especially by government, which is felt to be too uninformed to get the job done. So this is not a fox guarding the henhouse scenario, which is often at the root of perceptions of inadequate oversight. Rather, the problem as the public sees it might be best described as a troop of monkeys being tasked with refereeing a chess tournament. The monkeys are clearly in over their heads and are more likely to upset the chessboard, sending bishops and rooks flying in all directions than they are to keep things orderly and fair. And then there's also strong concerns about deep fakes and technologies that manipulate sound and images, making it even more difficult to know what is real and what is true, and that in a world that has already experienced the pernicious effects of fake news, troll farms, and bots. And yes, it's the actors, it's bad actors who have contaminated the information ecosystem, but their tool of choice has been technology. And so again, we see more potential for guilt by association. One of the biggest areas of emerging technological advancement, of course, is AI and robotics. But as you can see from this data here, rather than being seen as a boon, less than half of our respondents see it as having a mostly positive impact on privacy, jobs, the quality of human relationships, and on personal well-being in general, with privacy and jobs, and I would argue rightly so, being the epicenter of people's concern about these technologies. So once again, we're back to that change management problem. AI, robotics, this is one of the biggest areas of change happening in the world today, and people are viewing it with fear, uncertainty, and doubt more so than hope, excitement, and anticipation. Back in the day, back in my day, we all wanted jetpacks and flying cars, but no one wants to lose their job to a robot or a computer program. Basically, fear of job loss, worries about invasion of privacy, and concerns about being able to know what's real or not makes Luddites of us all. And it's not just AI that has some trust issues, it's all the emerging technologies that we examined this year. Technologies running the gamut from driverless cars to cell-cultured meat are just not being seen in a more positive than negative light. Now, interestingly and important, most people also don't know much, if anything, about these technologies. In fact, if you see here, and this is one of the most important slides in the deck, only about a quarter or less of people claim to know even a moderate amount about these technologies. And this is a failure that I would argue also lies at the feet of the technology sector, which seems to be relying on people self-educating rather than taking it upon itself to see that people understand emerging innovations. And this is unfortunate because main point number 3, an informed public is technology's best friend. People, as you can see here, who know a lot about technology are over twice as likely to view it as a positive than those who know nothing. So what we're seeing is that in a world, and this makes total sense, in a world of low trust and a lack of faith in institutions, the reflexive response to a new or unfamiliar technology is to be suspicious of it in the absence of someone giving us a really good reason to feel otherwise. So then, how do you increase trust in innovations? Well, the first step is informing and educating. And maybe your eyes are glazing over right now because being told that you need to inform and educate, it's easy to dismiss that piece of advice, that recommendation, as trite or even as lame, but this is just not being done, I think, as that knowledge data I just showed you indicates. And I would also argue that when technology does attempt to have a dialogue or a conversation about itself with the public, that the way it's done is not terribly effective. And so I go back one last time to the principles of good change management. When we ask people what would increase their trust in emerging technologies, their top 2 answers were communicate their downsides and communicate their benefits. Interestingly, in that order, they want to know the downsides and they want to know the benefits, but they want to know the downsides first. So if you recall, the first step in change management is to clearly define the change and align it to what's important to people. So my point number 4 is that when you talk about benefits, it's important to focus on and emphasize the benefits that I, as an individual, will experience firsthand. Just being cool or being futuristic or groundbreaking alone is not enough to sell people on innovation and progress these days. People need to know what's in robotics for them. Why will a driverless car make their lives better? Why should I want to eat meat grown in a petri dish? And when you're describing these upsides, don't over glamorize them and absolutely don't gloss over the potential downsides. Part of change management is determining its impact on those most likely to be affected and then implementing a support structure for those who will be affected or impacted negatively. So for example, an industry-led discussion about driverless automobiles that doesn't include an acknowledgement that taxi, limo, and truck drivers are going to lose their jobs is woefully, and I would even say perhaps immorally, incomplete. But you can't stop there. You can't just stop at acknowledging that, oh yeah, there might be some downsides, there might be some job loss. You need to explain to people your plan, what your plan is for helping those left behind, those whose lives and livelihoods will be rendered irrelevant by AI, a robot, or an autonomous vehicle. People need to know what support systems are being developed to protect and take care of the victims of that innovation by those who are in a position to profit the most from it. Or perhaps you're just sitting there thinking to yourself, well, isn't that somebody else's problem to solve? I just invent and create things. I'm the ideas guy. It's up to those who use them to address the consequences of that use as they arise. Well, it's not. And that brings me to my point number 5. As the engines, and this is you, as the engines and engineers of progress and innovation, you need to fully own the fact that sometimes those things have victims. And the faster those innovations occur, the less time society, its workers, the education system have to retool and reinvent themselves in response to those changes. AI and robotics don't just make other forms of technology and other machines obsolete. They also make certain job skills and the people who have supported themselves and their families with those job skills also become obsolete. So my last point is this. The technology sector needs to get out ahead of people's fears and participate in discussions, and not just amongst themselves, but with the public at large about the consequences, both intended and unintended, of their innovations. This includes defining and publicizing ethical codes that govern the development and use of technology. And you remember ethics. It's that thing which every institution, save NGOs, are perceived as lacking. At the same time, business, NGOs, and government need to work together on plans to help those displaced or disadvantaged by emerging technologies. And you know what's needed for any of these efforts to appear credible and to therefore actually reduce tech-based fear and anxiety? Well, of course, as you might guess, it's trust. The very thing I started out by saying that was in short supply. Because right now, while 80% of people think, or actually 79 to be precise, people think that business has a duty to retrain people affected by automation and innovation, only 30% of people trust that businesses will actually do this. So it is any wonder why tech's halo is starting to dim and why AI is not viewed with the same wonder, anticipation, and awe as the idea of personal jetpacks once were. People simply do not trust that the negative consequences of tech are going to be or are being adequately addressed. And with that, we've come full circle back to trust, and it's time to open things up for your questions and comments.
Great, thank you, David. That was excellent. If people want to post their questions in the question and answer box, we can start fielding some questions for David. But I'll start off with a question just before people start posting. I'm curious about the Trust Barometer as a thing, and I'm curious how long it's been going on, and whether what you're talking about in this year's report is different from what you've seen in the past, other than some of the trends that we've been seeing.
Yeah, so the Edelman Trust Barometer is just finished its 20th year. It started way back, and this might be before a lot of your people's times, the battle in Seattle, which was a meeting of big economic powers where NGOs sort of had protests going on outside about income inequality, just the unfairness of the system, sort of the lack of caring and humanity associated with capitalism. That's what started this whole thing. And so what we've done every year since, in differing number of countries in different years, is measure the level of trust that people have in their basic institutions. And the idea is that we delegate really important things to our well-being to these institutions. We delegate fairness, we delegate our financial security, we delegate dealing with major problems and issues and diseases and illness and privacy and any number of issues we rely on either NGOs or media or business, government to take care of those things, to address those things, to make sure that we're living in a society where everybody has an equal chance to flourish. And so in an environment where those institutions aren't trusted, that's just not a stable, good set of affairs. People feel bad, they don't trust their institutions, it's hard to get things done, people start scapegoating and blaming.
Mhm.
It's just a cauldron of nastiness, and it's hard to do anything positive when you're essentially bathed in a cauldron of nastiness. And so we've just found this to be a very important thing to be tracking and measuring over time. And so what we're seeing this year is not hugely different in terms of trust. Institutional trust has never been great globally. Certain markets are better than others, but we've never lived in this kumbaya, high trust, everybody's doing their job well environment. But what we have seen more recently over the past number of years is that this sort of chronic inability to trust the institutions around us are starting to sort of wear and tear on people. They're losing their optimism, they're losing sort of their faith in the system to ever repair itself. And we think that a chronic inability to trust, we think this sense of being left behind. And it's a data point that often gets just sort of quickly passed over. But this idea of over half of people across the globe feeling like they're losing respect and dignity, feeling like they're left behind, worrying about their economic future, that's the fuel for populism. That's the fuel for demagoguery. That's the fuel for things like Brexit, where people just get desperate for change, get desperate to be heard, are willing to try anything so they can start feeling better about the future. And oftentimes it's short-sighted and detrimental. But it just shows you the power and the importance of having trusted, well-functioning institutions leading us into the future.
Good, thanks. So we've got a bunch of questions now. I'm going to do Taffeta's first. I hope Taffeta is okay since she posted with her name with me actually allowing her to talk. So we're going to try this feature out. So Taffeta, if you'll unmute yourself and ask David your question.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I'm wondering if this loss of trust affects certain kinds of technologies more than others, depending on how well they penetrate the market, I guess is what you say, how many people have access to them, and what sorts of problems they're trying to solve. So like medicine, we know that we have technologies that some people don't have access to that could solve some of their health problems, right? But I wonder if health as a field has more of a patina of trustworthiness, just because it communicates that it cares for people.
Sure. So can you see the slide I have up now?
Yeah.
So you can see that on the far right, we have personalized medicines or gene mapping. So this was sort of the leading edge health technology we looked at. And you can see the numbers are better for personalized medicines than they are for, say, AI or blockchain. So I do think that being in the life-saving business does make tech or health technology seen in a slightly more positive light. Although if you look at things like electronic medical records and you start talking about privacy and data control issues, there even health technologies are somewhat problematic. But if you just sort of take this as a snapshot, you can see that health does better than some of these other technologies. And I would argue that part of the reason for that is, a new and better cure for cancer or personalized medicine has less of an obvious downside than, say, AI and robotics. So AI and robotics, people can see them replacing jobs. That, yes, it does good things, but the consequences are more apparent and more personal and are sort of more in the news. And those same kinds of consequences aren't as apparent, or maybe not even as real for something like medicine, which has much of less of a downside. And then you have something like cryptocurrency and blockchain. I think those numbers are low because it's inscrutable. It's an inscrutable technology that people don't understand. And as I was saying, when you don't understand, when you don't have information, and a lack of good reason to trust, people's reflexive response to technology these days is not to trust it. And I don't know if that's always been true. We don't quite go back far enough for me to be sure, but my sense is that technology did used to be seen with awe and wonder and amazement. And that's just not necessarily the first view, the first orientation people have to new technologies these days.
Thanks.
All right. So next, we had a question from Donovan. Donovan, if you'll unmute your mic, you can ask your question now.
Okay. Hi. Can you hear me fine?
Yep, we can hear you all right.
Oh, cool. Thank you. So my question involved the conclusion you stated earlier in your presentation, how pretty much trust in technology is correlated to how informed you are about that particular technology, correct?
Yeah, let me see if I can, let's see. Oh, no, wait. So this is, right. So this slide shows just how few people understand and know technology. And this shows you, so what we did here is we took all those 5 technologies that were on the previous page, and we essentially averaged their scores for people who thought it would have a mostly positive impact, an equally positive and negative impact, a more so negative impact, or they had no idea what the impact would be. And as you can see here, as you go from people who essentially knew nothing about these technologies to people who know a lot, you see a large growth in the percentage of people who think that technology is going to have a more positive than negative impact on society. So that's the data you're talking about. So what's your question?
Yes, correct. I guess my question was why exactly do you think that is? Because personally and within my friend group, the more we know about a technology, typically we become more distrustful and scared of it. An example could be with AI and machine learning. Advancements in AI and machine learning can have a pretty disastrous consequences, especially in the hands of distrusted entities. And yeah, so I guess my question is, why do you think this is?
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. So actually, when we were digging into some of the AI stuff, when I was writing the questionnaire, I had to do background research on it. And that's where I really kind of understood this idea of machines potentially becoming smarter than people and what that could mean. What are the consequences of that? And it did make me a little bit more trepidatious about that technology. But the data here shows pretty clearly that in general, knowing more, at least in terms of knowing nothing, does give people some level of reassurance. And it may be that that there's another side of this curve, in that if you really know a lot, like you're an insider, then you start to become a little bit more fearful again when you realize what's happening and what's possible. Although we did look at this data by tech employees, so people who weren't necessarily AI people, but people who were, who worked in a technological industry. And for the most part, they tend to, of course, be more knowledgeable, but they don't tend to necessarily be a lot less trusting. they were, interestingly and surprisingly, a little bit more in favor of regulation. So I think that's sort of a tip of the hat to the fact that there's so much potential good here, but I also know how it could go wrong. And so it's particularly important that we talk about how to use this stuff ethically. But it just seems that in general, among the population, and the population is defined for themselves, whether they know a moderate amount or a lot, there does seem to be a positive relationship that the more you know, the more comfortable you get with the technology. Why exactly that is may just be that even knowing not a lot doesn't get you sort of in the position where you are, which is we really know how this can go wrong, and that kind of scares us a little bit.
Okay, thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Right. All right. I think I kicked Taffeta off on accident. So Donovan, I think you should still be here. I think I pressed the wrong button for Taffeta. Good. All right. It looks like you're still here. All right. Sorry about this. All right. So next is Mary. If you'll unmute yourself, Mary, you can ask your question.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Chris. So thank you. This is an interesting talk. And my comment was that actually I remember reading similar studies about this when teaching our required technical writing class. And also I led the initiation of our student research symposium, and their mission are similar, which is to communicate science and technology to general audiences so that the general audiences can understand. And that this kind of communication, just what you were saying a minute ago, helps to build that trust. So basically the studies that I had looked at says that, you know, that there used to be, for example, when I was young, NASA, we heard about NASA all the time. The public was very much involved, you know, with what NASA was doing. And now it's on the back pages of the news if we even do hear of it. So, and technology does happen so quickly, as you were pointing out. Basically, the general public feels like scientists and technology, they're all like working in secret. You know, they're doing like these secret things, and therefore that causes people to not trust. So I just wanted to say, basically, you know, my comment was to go along with just what you were saying. And that's exactly when we teach our technical writing and have our student research symposium, what we're telling our students is you need to learn to talk to people outside of your discipline and even people who don't know that much about science and technology, because they are your stakeholders. I mean, public dollars actually help a lot of these technologies to grow through taxes and funding and so forth. And so if they don't understand what's going on, they're not going to want monies to be going to technology, and they are going to be fearful.
Oh, and I didn't put this slide in here, but there's also a strong relationship between how much you know about the technology and the feeling that it's underregulated. So again, what you find is that the less you know, the more the more regulated, or the more underregulated you think the technology is. So I go back to that point that I was making earlier, that sort of an informed public is technology's best friend. But I don't think they're doing a good job about that. And I remember, you know, again, it was years ago, but there used to be writers who sort of made a living translating technology into publicly accessible books. They were sort of, their job was to make technology and science understandable and relatable to the normal person. And I just don't necessarily see that type of writing or that type of book out there as much. You know, you get a little bit of that in sort of the New Yorker. Who's that author that talked about, talks a little bit about science, like choosing and you know, sort of different ways of decision making. There's a little bit out there, but there isn't enough people sort of in that role of making technology accessible and understandable, generating excitement, removing sort of this veil of ignorance, uncloaking the black box. There isn't enough people out there who sort of take it upon themselves as their job, as what they do, to fulfill that role. And I think we're kind of missing that. And this data leads me to believe that we're sort of missing that. And we're missing that at a time when perhaps it's the most needed that it's ever been, because we are seeing some cracks in the trust foundation. And we are seeing innovations where the downside is a little bit more apparent and is a little bit more within people's daily lives. And those kind of innovations, I think, are different than the kind we were talking about before. Medical advances. Medical advances don't cause people to lose their jobs in the same way as robotics and AI does. So there's different kinds of technologies, and some of those really do have a negative impact on people's lives, and there's not enough conversation about what that impact is and what we're going to do about it. I mean, the conclusion isn't that we should cut back on AI and robotics. The idea is that we should be completely honest about what the downsides are, who is going to be hurt and how, and start building that support system now, start the retraining now. As businesses adopt technology, they should be simultaneously thinking about what they're going to do for the people who were displaced by that technology. And it's just that kind of thinking that isn't happening, that kind of planning that isn't apparent. And I think we're starting to see technology lose a bit of its halo because of that.
All right. Well, if Mary doesn't have any follow-ups, we'll go to the next question. Let's see. So there's a couple of anonymous questions that I think are worth answering. So one of them was, do you believe that companies would be open in making the changes necessary for trust?
Would they be open? You know, that's an interesting question, actually, and it might be a lot bigger question than the asker even realized, because one of the things that we're seeing these days is that it's not a question of companies and businesses being open. It's more the fact that they have to. So, you think back 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, companies would have these CSR things. It would be sort of their corporate social responsibility. And what would that mean? That would mean you would have this function within your company that would give out money, support the arts, build a school, engage in some sort of good. But it was very much a siloed function that was bolted onto a company. And what we've seen over the past 10, 15 years or so is that that's not good enough anymore. And part of it is in response to some of that data I was showing you earlier. Remember, government being the trust albatross, being, let's grab that slide. Trust being seen as very much, government being seen as the least competent and the least ethical of our social institutions. And what we found is that in response to the fact that government just isn't getting it done because it's inept, it's unethical, and it's completely sort of moribund due to partisanship, what people have done is they started turning to business and to brands to get things done, to address social problems, to create and be an agent of positive change. And I think they're attracted to business because business is the doer. It's the competent one. It's interesting because they could have gone to NGOs, because NGOs are the ones with the heart of gold, but they're not good at getting things done. So given the choice, people have gone to business because they just want to see things get done. And associated with this idea of business sort of being the last adult in the room, business being the hero or the savior, sort of stepping in, to where government hasn't been able to succeed in making things better, that has carried with it new expectations and new responsibilities. So now you see things like consumers buying or not buying based on ideology and based on whether the brand has a purpose and is doing good in the world. It's not just whether or not you have that little pink ribbon on the can of tuna fish. It's really about, is this business, is this company defined around a set of values? Does it have a mission and a purpose beyond profitability? And depending on if it does and what that mission is, I'm going to decide who I'm going to do business with and who I'm not going to do business with. So business is getting pressure from consumers to be more involved, to be more engaged, to be more values driven. At the same time, you have employees. And this, of course, was much truer when the employment rate was really small than it is now. But when you have a full employment economy, employees have a lot of power. And what we were seeing is that employees were beginning to expect that the companies and organizations they worked for would be values driven, would have a mission, would have a purpose, that those organizations would be making the world a better place. And in deciding who they wanted to work for, they were sensitive to those issues and values. And they wanted to work for a company that not only did good, but a company that empowered them as employees and then allowed them to use that empowerment to be part of the good. So they didn't just want to work for a company that was doing good things and sit on the sideline and applaud. They wanted to be part of the good things that that company was doing. And companies that engaged in behavior that the employees felt uncomfortable with, those employees would become more activist. And so you saw walkouts at various companies who were doing business around surveillance or doing business around detaining kids at the border. And so you started seeing consumer activism, you started seeing employee activism, and not surprisingly, right after that, you started seeing investors, the stockholders, the people who own these businesses saying, you know what, I need to invest in companies that have a multi-stakeholder view, companies that naturally take into account not only returning money to shareholders, but who are also sensitive to their customers and what their customers needed and what their communities needed and what employees needed, because businesses that weren't sensitive to all of those stakeholders, businesses that couldn't look beyond the bottom line, they were on borrowed time because there was all of this pressure and expectation and activism. And so as a result, I don't think businesses have a choice. I think businesses need to weigh in, to be more socially active, to be more responsive, to sort of cleaning up their own messes, to making the world a better place, to being values and purpose led, because if they don't, they're not going to survive and they're certainly not going to thrive.
Thanks. Yeah, and like Riley's mentioning in the chat here, there's lots of examples of this kind of thing, like with Google and Project Dragonfly as well as another one. So Subhashis had a good question that's almost connected to this, almost the flip side. So Subhashis, I'm going to allow you to talk, and if you'll unmute your mic, you can ask David your question.
Sure. So you mentioned that informed people realize the need for regulation. So my question is, did your surveys measure this desire for regulation? And if you did, how does it correlate with the less informed versus more informed people?
Yeah, so we did look at whether or not people thought that these new emerging technologies, and we measured it in the context of the emerging technologies. So that would be these guys right here. And what we did find is that there is a relationship. So as you might expect, there was a relationship between the more you know, the more you think that these technologies are likely to be more positive than negative. the more likely you are to trust them, and therefore the less likely you are to feel that they are underregulated. The only group that was a little higher on regulation than people who let me be clear about this. The only group that had high levels of knowledge that were more likely to say that a technology needed to be regulated were people in that industry. So people in the industry know a lot. People outside the industry may say they know a lot, but the people who know a lot within the industry are more likely to say that we're a little underregulated than people who know a lot outside of that industry. And I think it goes back to sort of that first question. At some level, you really are intimate with these technologies. You know what could potentially go wrong, and you start to be more circumspect about, you know, there needs to be some sort of governor on this, some sort of outside control to make sure that the worst doesn't happen. So it's sort of this, the curve loops a little bit, that as you become more knowledgeable, you worry less about regulation until you reach a point where you're very knowledgeable because you're in the middle of it, and there you see a little bit more of an uptick in the felt need to regulate.
Thank you.
Good. All right, so I'll do one question more from the Q&A, and I think there's a little bit of time for maybe one more question after this if somebody has a quick question. But somebody anonymously asked, what are your feelings on trusting or improving trust in institutions to correctly use technologies like facial recognition?
Well, so sort of that, it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg kind of thing, in that, again, facial recognition itself is not good or evil, it's how it's used. And I go back to sort of that first point that I was making. Right now, it's being used by institutions that aren't trusted, and in many cases aren't seen as being ethical. That's what the problem is. And the question then becomes, is it being viewed as sort of unethical because these institutions are actually using it in unethical ways, or is it being viewed as unethical or in some way problematic because it's being used by institutions that just aren't trusted? Either way, the answer is that these institutions need to get their act together. They need to be seen as fair and competent and ethical in order for their use of technology to be viewed in a more positive, less worrisome light.
Good. Thanks. Yeah, I think that answers that question well. There's a couple more anonymous questions, but since Taffeta asked, I think, a really good question, I'll bring her back on for the last question.
Okay.
So Taffeta, if you'll, unmute yourself.
Okay. So I'm wondering if there isn't a progress in technology that has brought us to kinds of technology that are doing something different, and that's partly why we distrust them. So if you compare the AI technologies to previous technologies, it's like, you know, early car technology improvements allowed you to be more in control and to know what, I mean, you could see, they were more transparent, right? Whereas new AI sort of developments are really vulnerable to what they're trained on. And they also, it's sort of like they're taking the supervision away from the users. So the users aren't burdened with monitoring them anymore, but we also, it seems like we can only program some endpoint, and we're not sure how the technology is getting us there. And we might want to question what it's doing along the way. Sort of like, you know, if you happen to be in the driver's seat in the autonomous vehicle, occasionally you do want to change its course, right? Or you worry about it hitting a pedestrian. And so I'm sort of wondering if the problem of the training is now not only for the people in these industries, like the people whose jobs are getting displaced, who used to be drivers, but also for those of us who are consumers. you know, in how we can be informed about what we're actually doing when we use these technologies. Does that make sense?
I didn't quite get the question there. I mean, yeah,
So,
obviously the more knowledge, the better.
and in some of the AI, you know, the optimal solutions may be ones that rely on algorithms that aren't actually working according to the criteria that we value. So if we only try them with certain input and get certain outputs, we won't see that in other circumstances, they're going to make choices that we wouldn't like.
Right.
So, I mean, it just seems like inherently it's harder to train on that because you don't understand, if you look under the hood, what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the technology is harder to wrap your head around because it's not a thing or a machine in the traditional sense where you could sort of understand how all the moving parts work together and what's possible, or it's a thing and you shoot it into my arm and I start feeling better. It's very abstract, which I think makes it extremely difficult to wrap your head around, and maybe even makes the possibility of unintended consequences even greater than what you see with other technologies, because you don't know what it's going to do when you're not looking. And almost by definition, it's supposed to be growing and doing different things and becoming more sophisticated, even without us, you know, directly intervening or twisting a knob.
Right, yeah.
Anyway, I've got to jump to my next call, but this has been great. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yes, of course. If everybody will join me in thanking David. This is a great talk, a great way to kick off the series. I hope you all take care of yourselves, stay safe, and thank you again, David, for sharing your research with us.
Thank you.